Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is 15.7 conditions for rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. So these are special types of parallelograms. Okay, these are actually, let's just write it here. Special, oops, if I can spell special, p-grams. Okay, so all of these guys, I can't stress this enough. So I'm going to start it off here. All rectangles, rhombuses, and squares are classified as a parallelogram. Okay. But on top of that, they have these special other characteristics. Okay. So for this is a rectangle. And why a rectangle? Sorry about that. Why a rectangle is a rectangle, right? What special characteristics from a p-gram is there? Well, a rhombus always has a 90-degree angle, right? Or a rectangle always has a 90-degree angle. And that is our first rule. If one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle, then it is a rectangle. I should put rectangle. Okay? If one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle, then it is a rectangle. Okay? So all angles is equal to 90 degrees. Okay? That is the trait that it has, right? So meaning this is a parallelogram because if all angles are right angles, aren't opposite angles congruent to each other? Yeah, they are. Right? So they hold that characteristic. That's why it's a parallelogram. But they go more in depth and say, hey, look, it's a right angle. Okay? The next one, what's so special about a rectangle is when we draw the diagonals, the diagonals are going to be congruent. Okay, so A, B, C, D. So that's my next rule here, or my next characteristic here. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Okay? So you know that the diagonals are congruent. In this case, it's going to be AC is congruent to BD. Okay? That's what makes a rectangle a rectangle. They still bisect each other. So we can take this a step further and say if BE is equal to BD or ED, right? If they're congruent to each other, right? Because E bisects BD, correct? From the parallelogram. But if BD is equal to AC and E cuts both of them in half, all these little pieces are going to be equal to each other. You guys see that? So I can also say BE is congruent to DE, which is also congruent to AE, which is congruent to CE. I can say all of that. Okay? All right. Moving on to a rhombus. Okay, so this is what a rhombus is. All right, and the first characteristic I want to cover is that in a rhombus, consecutive sides are congruent. Okay, so here is my rule or my characteristic. If one pair of consecutive sides of a p-gram are congruent, then the p-gram is a rhombus. All right, so the characteristic here is that all sides are congruent. Okay, why are all sides congruent? I know that this is a rhombus. I know that this is a parallelogram, right? So if I have a pair of consecutive sides that are congruent, right? You're given that. Well, I know opposite sides are congruent, right? So if this side has one tick mark, then this side has to have one tick mark. If this side has one tick mark, then the opposite side must have one tick mark. Okay, let's try and do that with numbers. Let's say that that's 10 and that's 10 and that's given to you, right? Yeah. If they're both 10s, if this side is 10 units long, then this side is 10 units long because opposite sides are congruent, right? If this side is 10 units long, then this side is also 10 units long. So they're all 10 units long. That's why the characteristic here is all sides being congruent to each other. All right. The next characteristic here deals with the next two deals with the diagonals. Okay. The diagonals here, look how perfect that is. If I look at it like this, class, right? What do you guys think this angle is? Huh? 90 degrees. Yeah. The diagonals will always be perpendicular. Okay. So if the diagonals of a p-gram are perpendicular, remember this notation is perpendicular, then the p-gram is a rhombus. Okay. I just shorthand what the characteristic is. And the last one, the diagonals here as well, each diagonal, it bisects the angle it's coming from. So that's congruent to that. That one's congruent to that one. This one is congruent to this one. And this one is congruent to this one. Okay. Notice the tick marks. All right. Opposite angles are congruent, correct? If the diagonal bisects it, that means that it cuts it in half. So half of the same number is the same number, correct? So if this was 50 degrees, this was 50 degrees, both of them are 50 degrees. Half of 50 is 25, right? So all of these little angles here will be 25. That's why they have the same tick mark. Okay? So if one diagonal of a p-gram bisects a pair of opposite angles, then the p-gram is a rhombus. I'm just gonna put bisects the angle. All right. So those are the special type of characteristics a rectangle and a rhombus has. Yes. Okay. All right. The next part of this, I'm going to try and make a Venn diagram. Not a Venn diagram, but just a diagram itself. It's called the quadrilateral diagram. Okay? The quadrilateral diagram in this big umbrella of quadrilaterals, okay, you're gonna have two types of quadrilaterals, okay? One type is what we know, parallelograms, parallelograms, and the other type is what we call a trapezoid, okay? So the traits of a parallelogram are opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, and the diagonals bisect each other, right? Those are the characteristics of a parallelogram, okay? Underneath the parallelogram quadrilateral, right? Underneath it, you have a rectangle, which is a special type of parallelogram, and a rhombus, right? We just went over what they are, the characteristics. In a rectangle, all angles are 90 degrees, and then the diagonals are congruent, right? Those two are the special types of characteristics. In a rhombus, all sides are congruent. Diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisects the angle, right? All right, so that's the special characteristics of a rectangle and of a rhombus, correct? Okay. The last one we said in the beginning, it was conditions for a rectangle, rhombus, and a square, right? Notice that I didn't put anything about a square yet. Because what a rectangle and a rhombus, what they do is they make a square. Okay? So there's no special characteristics for a square, but it has both of the rectangle and rhombus's special characteristics. Okay? So a square does have all angles are 90 degrees. A square's diagonals are congruent. And that's a bad square, but okay. They're all 90 degrees. The diagonals are congruent. The diagonals are perpendicular. The diagonals bisect the angles, right? All the sides are congruent. So all the sides are congruent. And all of these special diagonal characteristics. Okay? You can think of a rectangle and a rhombus came together and made a baby, and they named it square. Okay? All right, that's the list of all the special parallelograms. So all rectangles are parallelograms. Okay, all squares are parallelograms. All squares are rectangles. All squares are rhombus. Notice as you go up the list, right? It's all. All squares are rectangles, rhombuses, and parallelograms. All rhombuses are parallelograms. All rectangles are parallelograms. Okay, so as you go up this drawing, let me put it up here. As you go up, it's all. Okay, so all squares, all rectangles, all rhombuses are parallelograms. All squares are rectangles, all squares are rhombuses, all squares are parallelograms. Okay? As you come down the list, right? As you go down, it's sum. Okay? Sum or can be. This parallelogram can be a rectangle. This parallelogram can be a rhombus. Or some is better, huh? Some parallelograms are rectangles, some parallelograms are rhombuses, some rectangles are squares, right? Some rhombuses are squares. I'm gonna put some. Okay? So knowing that difference will help you out as well. All right? And that's the lesson for 15.7. Okay? So just take note of the diagonals are going to be key in classifying what quadrilateral you have. All right? And that is the lesson for 15.7. See you guys on the next one.